Today I want to talk about linen. We are known all over the world for our linen. So what all was involved in the making of it during peak production time? Let's go back to the second half of the 1800s and take a look. Before there were linen mills, linen production was like a cottage industry, with everything being carried out in the home or farm where it was grown. And it would have been considered a nice earner for a family who were able to carry out all those processes themselves. There were so many processes and so many marvellous words and names that have been given to those processes. Linen started off life as a flax plant with a woody stalk and a wee blue flower, grown in a field. When the flower disappeared, it was time for harvesting. The plant was then pulled out by the roots. It wasn't cut. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, the outer stalk or shell was so tough it was hard to cut. The second is that the fibre inside those stalks was so precious that if you cut it, you wasted some, whereas if you pulled it out by the roots, there was no wastage. The next thing to be done, it had to be soaked to soften the outer shell so as you could get at the flax. This was then put into a pond or a body of water and left to soak for 10 or so days. This process was called retting, and apparently it was a very stinky, smelly process. After about 10 days, the stalks were then taken out and put into bundles and left to dry in a field, and these bundles were called stooks. I love that word. So once the stooks were completely dry, they were taken to a scutching mill to go through the process of scutching, which was beating the stalks until the fibres outside, the stalks, the shell broke and released the fibres from inside. And that was the actual flax that was going to be spun. The scutchers, the men who worked in the scutching mills, were often in danger of losing fingers. Such was the force and power of the machinery used at this stage of the process. Inside the stalks was this fine hair-like fibre known as flax. It was still a bit tatty, but this would soon be remedied. It was in this raw state that it was sent to a flax spinning mill for the next stage of its journey. At the mill, the flax was raked through big steel combs to untangle it until it was super fine enough to be spun into yarn. This process was called haggling, and the men who did it were called hagglers. Once it passed inspection and was fine enough, it was passed to the women who did the spinning. These were the doffers, and it was their job to operate the huge mechanical looms which transformed the raw flax into fine linen threads. Some of the flax was spun dry and some was spun wet. The fine yarn or threads had to be wet spun, and most of the women worked on their bare feet because of the water and the chemicals from the looms were on the floor and they didn't want to damage their shoes. It was a humid, horrible environment for the women to work in, but it was a haven for the cockroaches. So it was here that the yarn was spun onto great big wooden bobbins, and they were then sent to a weaving factory to be made into the linen fabric, which was destined to be made into many, many different things for many different purposes and sent all over the world, labelled as fine Irish linen. Well, that's the bones of the story of the making of linen. There's a lot more to it back in the day. And I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting, and I will be back again soon to talk more about words, names and different things associated with linen.